O tēnā koutou katoa, ngā mihi nui kia koutou katoa. Good afternoon to you from Tamaki Makaurau, Auckland. My name is Murray Bruges. I'm the director of the Helen Clark Foundation, Mahiarongo. Thank you for joining us today for a webinar exploring transparency in New Zealand's political and governing systems, moderated by Helen Clark, with expert panelists, former Attorney General Christopher Finlayson, Professor Yuen Yuen Ang, and the report's author, Philippa Yasbek. Before we get started, I want to especially acknowledge our Helen Clark Foundation members in the audience today. Our foundation is evidence-based, independent, non-partisan public policy think tank. We rely on our members and donor support to do our work. If you enjoy these sessions, but you're not currently a foundation member, please do consider joining. Membership is affordably priced at $65 a year if you're waged, or $35 a year if you're unwaged. When you're signing up, you're not just helping us to deliver long-term solutions to New Zealand's key challenges, you're also able to join our foundation's members-only webinars to get advanced copies of new reports and priority entry to our events. As it happens, we have a members-only webinar next Tuesday featuring international affairs journalist Peter Bale in conversation with Helen Clark about key global trends and her recent time in New York during the United Nations High-Level Week and General Assembly. So if you'd like to hear what world leaders are saying about a tense period in global affairs, please consider signing up today as a member at Helen Clark, that's all one word, .foundation, after which you'll be able to register for that webinar. Members can also attend in-person events such as a talk by the New Zealand Minister of Trade, Todd McClay, that our foundation is co-hosting Monday, 14 October in Central Auckland. If you're a member and keen to attend that session, please do send us an email at contact@helenclark.foundation. We'll also be co-hosting a public webinar with the New Zealand Initiative on congestion charging next month, which you can now register for on our website. So keep an eye out for that and other webinar announcements in your inbox. And please do consider forwarding these webinars onto friends and families. It really helps us grow the Foundation's audience and boost the impact of our work. So if you're new to our webinars, and it looks like we've got a lot of new viewers today, it's worth noting this is not a normal Zoom call. Your cameras and microphones are off. There's no risk anyone can see or hear you eating your lunch. We would love for you to participate in this webinar, however, and the best way to do that is for you to submit questions for our panelists as they occur to you during the webinar. You can type them into Zoom's Q&A function, which you can access at the bottom of your screen right around there. You can also upvote other people's questions by clicking the thumbs up button. Around the 40-minute mark, Helen will put those questions to our panelists. You'll see there's a separate chat function. We might use that to put relevant links during the webinar, but put your questions for panelists in the Q&A function, please. Finally, we're always looking to improve our webinars and would love to hear your views on today's session. You should see a feedback prompt in your browser at the end of this webinar and/or receive a form by email the next day or so. It only takes about 2 minutes and it's very helpful to us as we design future webinars. With that, I'll hand over to our Foundation's patron, the Right Honourable Helen Clark, to introduce our panelists and kick off today's webinar. Thanks, Helen.
Thank you, Murray, and good afternoon, everyone watching in New Zealand and whatever time of day elsewhere in the world. Well, we've got 3 terrific panelists today to discuss this issue of how to shine a light and improve transparency in the New Zealand governance and political systems. First, Philippa Yasbek, I'll be calling on. Philippa has written the report on these issues for the Helen Clark Foundation. She's an accomplished researcher, has worked on a range of issues, and actually co-authored a report for us previously when we were looking at the harm reduction issues around methamphetamine in New Zealand. So welcome, Philippa. Also new to our webinars is Professor Yuen Yuen Ang from Johns Hopkins University from the Washington, D.C. campus, talking to us from Ann Arbor in Michigan, US today. Yuen has done some very interesting work on a typology of corruption and piloted an unbundled corruption index. And she has made a differentiation between what's called access money, also a concept that Philippa introduced in the report, from the conventional focus on bribery, embezzlement, and extortion. So we're very much looking forward to hearing Yuen's insights today. And then the Honourable Chris Finlayson, who needs no introduction to a Kiwi audience because he has been a very distinguished lawyer, is a very distinguished lawyer, has been New Zealand's Attorney General, has been the Minister for Treaty Negotiations. He's an author, long-term law practitioner, and wrote the foreword to the report. So a very big welcome to you, Chris, today too. We know you're a busy man and really appreciate your time. So with no further ado, I'm going to swing into some questions to the panelists, and then of course we're going to be looking at what questions you put as the audience in the Q&A, so we can come to those as well. But first, to Philippa. The report you did for the Foundation on transparency and the risks of political corruption in New Zealand ran to over 60 pages. So I think for the viewers, just an overview of the key issues and recommendations would be really helpful. Go for it.
Sure, thank you, Helen. So low levels of corruption are really part of New Zealanders' self-identity, and we rely on a lack of corruption as part of our business environment. It's how we market ourselves. But we have been slipping down through the international rankings, the Corruption Perceptions Index, and we've also had declines in our absolute scores as well. So I focused the report on access money, and Yuen Yuen's going to explain what that is in a bit more detail, but it's essentially the rewards extended by business actors to powerful officials in exchange for exclusive and valuable privileges. So it can, and it's often not necessarily illegal, and it can appear to stimulate economic activity, particularly as it enriches people who are rewarded by politicians, but it also creates quite big distortions in the economy as we build up industries that have better lobbyists rather than industries that necessarily are the most efficient or in line with our competitive advantages. And when you get those kinds of economic distortions, you end up breeding systemic risk and you exacerbate inequality. There's quite a strong belief that access money is a problem in New Zealand. Obviously, we don't ask that question specifically, but about 2/3 of New Zealanders agree that the economy is rigged to advantage the rich and powerful. And the issue with this perception of increased levels of corruption is that it undermines trust in our institutions. We think it's been driven by a variety of factors. Obviously, we have increasing income and wealth inequality. There have been changes in political norms over time. Much of New Zealand's, or quite a lot of New Zealand's sort of anti-corruption measures actually rely on social norms and sort of soft law things like the cabinet manual rather than hard laws that, you know, lay out clear dividing lines and have penalties as well. There's definitely a perception that vested interests have a strong influence in political decision-making, and there's a lack of transparency around things like lobbying and political donations. And there are some real risks if the erosion of trust continues. It's the kind of thing that paves the way for authoritarian leaders to come in. You'll see many authoritarian leaders rely on rhetoric of being against corruption. So, you know, in the US, there's the whole kind of drain the swamp rhetoric. Putin himself has sort of run on a kind of anti-corruption platform, and many people in Russia sort of think that the problem with corruption is that the local officials are corrupt, and if only their leader knew, you know, things would be different. So, you know, and obviously it's much easier to maintain trust and to strengthen institutions than it is to try and claw back that trust once it's been lost. So we've focused on 5 domains where we think central government can make a difference. Well, both where there's a big issue and where central government can make a difference. The first one's lobbying. And I should disclose here that I do unpaid lobbying activity on gun control issues. But I certainly do not have all of the tricks up my sleeve that I'm going to talk about now. Lobbying is an important activity. It's often how lawmakers find out about issues, get into them. But New Zealand has had a massive increase in the number of professional lobbyists. And we're quite unusual amongst our comparator countries in having almost no regulation of that professional lobbying. The OECD in particular is quite concerned about this and think that it has been creating distortions in our economy. There's certainly concerns that particular groups have undue influence on public policy to detriment to the public good. So, for example, generally when you see governments making decisions that are very unpopular and that don't seem to be particularly good for people, usually the only explanation is that there has been strong lobbying on that issue. A lot of lobbyists have access to decision makers that ordinary people don't enjoy. And there's also a very big revolving door between senior government roles, ministerial advisory roles, and lobbying. So somebody will be working in the beehive one week and then, they'll have quit, and the next day or, next week they're showing up lobbying their old colleagues. So we've made some recommendations around regulating lobbying, having a register of lobbyists, a recording of contact between lobbyists and decision makers, mandatory code of conduct for lobbyists, and a stand down period for movements between decision-making positions and lobbying. The second issue highlighted is political donations. Our political party funding system is open to abuse. The main reason it doesn't get abused too much is because there's not traditionally been that much money spent on elections, but the amount of money involved is increasing quite significantly from one election to the next. There have definitely been cases where donors have very clear expectation of a quid pro quo for their donations. They're expecting quite a specific outcome rather than just donating because of a general ideological alignment with the party that they're donating to. These weaknesses have been recognised for a long time. There was the Independent Electoral Review, which made a number of recommendations, and we've largely endorsed those. We think there's probably some room to strengthen them around third-party promoters. These are people who are not parties themselves, but who do promote certain policies or parties during an election. So we like to see only registered electors making donations, with limits on the size of donations, and improving the disclosure of those donations, as well as strengthening the offence provisions. And the third issue we looked at was the Official Information Act, which is the legislation that allows people to access information generated by the government. It's a very important source of information about lobbying activity. So most of what we know about how lobbyists operate has come from the Official Information Act rather than other kinds of disclosures. But over time, it's working less well because it's become politicized. And there are no penalties in it. So we've made some recommendations for improving that, based largely on what the Law Commission has previously recommended. So we'd like to see some penalties, and we'd also like to see the coverage expanded to include some elements of parliamentary services. And then the fourth area covered was foreign bribery. So New Zealand has very strong protections against domestic bribery, but quite weak measures to stop New Zealand companies from engaging in bribery overseas. The OECD have been trying for years to get us to change our laws that New Zealand companies that are engaging in bribery overseas, particularly speed money bribery, face consequences back home. This is a measure to stop the supply of bribery. And we think those changes can be fairly easily made. And the last area that we've recommended changes is around beneficial ownership. So beneficial owner of a corporate entity is the natural person, the human being who ultimately owns and exercises control over that corporate entity. And most companies, this isn't an issue, it's quite clear who owns them, but you do see some really complex ownership structures that get set up. And they're usually not set up for very benign reasons. So they can be set up for tax avoidance reasons, money laundering, facilitating the payment of bribes, or hiding the identity of political donors, or hiding lobbying activity. A number of international bodies have recommended that we establish a registry of beneficial ownership. And we think this is important, and that we should also consider how this would cover trusts. This is sort of it's not the most, it's quite a technical area, not necessarily the most exciting, but it kind of underpins and helps reinforce some of the other recommendations made in the report. And so 5 areas, we'll get into some of those a bit more. But I think the thing I want to emphasize is that too frequently in New Zealand, we have this, she'll be right, shrug our shoulders, it's all fine, until there's actually a crisis. And then everyone scrambles madly to kind of, shut the stable door after the horse has bolted. But the crises are often foreseeable. We know about the weaknesses in our laws and institutions. Crises are also really costly. They damage people's lives, and sometimes, the damage just can't be repaired. So instead of waiting for a major crisis, what we're proposing here is to, forestall that, do things now, so that we reduce the risks and perceptions of corruption. That's the summary. So thank you, Helen.
Thank you, Philippa. You ended on beneficial ownership, which is actually an extremely important issue. I chair, as some know, the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, which has a standard for good governance with extractives. And one of the requirements for complying with the standard, which around 55 countries, almost all developing countries do, is to have a beneficial ownership register. We definitely need, in my opinion, better law on this, particularly given the current emphasis on the extractive sectors. Worldwide, they have been sectors which have been particularly prone to corruption risks and really robbing citizens of the birthright that might have been theirs. So just something to bear in mind against the context of the extractives debate in New Zealand at the present time. Professor Yuen, in your work, as I said earlier, you developed a typology of corruption. Tell us a bit more about how you see excess money, how you define it, and where or how does it most commonly manifest itself?
Thank you very much, Helen. I'm very excited and honored to see the Helen Clark Foundation report engaging with my research and in particular emphasizing the risk of excess money. This is a concept I introduced in a new typology of corruption, the Unbundled Corruption Index, or UCI. This is a pilot effort covering 15 cases, and you can also find it in my book, China's Gilded Age. So why did I create the UCI? The reason is that conventional corruption metrics, primarily Transparency International's Corruption Perceptions Index, the World Bank's Control of Corruption Index, are flawed or even misleading. They measure corruption as a one-dimensional problem, and these metrics consistently show us that rich democracies are very clean, while only poor countries are highly corrupt. So these one-dimensional metrics like the CPI, number one, obscure the fact that different types of corruption cannot be reduced to a single score. And number two, they systematically undermeasure what I call excess money, an activity that tends to be legalized, institutionalized, and ambiguously unethical, as opposed to bribery, embezzlement, and extortion. So to give you an overview of the 4 types of corruption, I'm going to briefly share my screen and show you my elemental skills in drawing. So I hope everyone can see this 4-part figure showing you 4 types of corruption. Now in this typology, you can see corruption divided along 2 dimensions. The first dimensions being whether that activity is being carried out by non-elites like street-level police officers or elites like national political leaders and big companies. The second dimension tells us whether that particular activity involves theft of public resources or whether it involves exchanges. The intersection of these 2 dimensions produces 4 types of corruption. Now, the public is familiar with the first 3 types. Number 1, petty theft. You can think of that as an example, police officers shaking down people on the street in an extortionary way. The second is what I call grand theft, national elites siphoning massive sums from public treasuries into private accounts overseas. And the third is speed money, petty bribes paid to regular officials to overcome red tape and delay and to grease the wheels of bureaucracy. Now, all of these three types are illegal. They are rampant in poor country and they are condemned. But corruption comes in a fourth and more elusive variety, and that is what I call access money. In this kind of transactional activity, powerful capitalists offer high-stakes rewards to powerful officials or policymakers in exchange, not just for speed, but also for access to exclusive, lucrative privileges. Examples include bailouts, cheap credit, land grants, monopoly rights, procurement contracts, tax breaks, and the like. Access money can manifest in illegal forms, such as massive bribes and kickbacks, but it also exists in perfectly legal forms. An example is lobbying, which Philippa highlighted earlier. Now, lobbying by itself, there's absolutely nothing wrong with it. Lobbying is a legitimate means of political representation in democracies such as the United States. Taken to an extreme, however, lobbying can be abused. Extremely powerful and wealthy lobby groups can fund political campaigns in exchange for outsized influence over laws and policy. So by differentiating between these four types of corruption, what I hope to do is to help us bring awareness to the distinction between what might be termed corruption of poor countries, which we are all familiar with, bribery, embezzlement, extortion. But the fourth type is the one that we have always been underemphasizing for a long time, which is access money. So I'm really delighted and very impressed by the Helen Clark Foundation's efforts in your willingness to confront the risk of access money. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Yuen. And as you say, this is particularly relevant to the high-income countries that tend to get a clean bill of health on these other indices, which, as you point out, are one-dimensional and are missing these very important points that you and Philippa are making. So thanks, and we'll come back to you again shortly. So coming to the Honourable Chris Finlayson, Chris, Philippa reinforced the point from her report that New Zealand has relied for a long time on the social norms and ethical norms of politicians in New Zealand society to protect us against corruption. And, you know, for a long time, those seem to more or less work. So what is changing now that leads us to think we can't just rely on that anymore? Do we need more legislative change and regulation, as Philippa has suggested this, to better protect us from the risks of political corruption?
I think the short answer is yes, and I think Philippa's report is an excellent piece of work, and I was really delighted to write a foreword to it. It's a very good question, and I think I've got to preface it by saying our standards are still very high, but we're slipping. And when it comes to corruption, then I think we need to take a zero tolerance approach. Any form of corruption in this country eats away at the social fabric and political fabric and cannot be tolerated. I've always, in my time in politics, never had a particular concern about what I call the big beasts of politics, the National Party and the Labour Party. You could disagree with your political opponents on the other side, but corruption was never anything that you would possibly consider. They were issues-based. And in New Zealand's history, I suppose there have always been questions that have arisen from time to time about how was a new road put into Kinloch and so on from the 1960s. There are those sorts of issues. But by and large, I think the big beasts of politics understand that someone comes into their caucus, they don't get promotion immediately, except in special circumstances. They learn the system. And when they become ministers, they understand the cabinet manual, which sets out the way in which people should behave themselves. And if they get things wrong, you've got senior colleagues who'll keep an eye on them. But the political culture in this country, I think, has changed. And in some ways, it's no bad thing. As you know, there was a feeling that first past the post wasn't working and the two-party state wasn't an adequate response to some of our needs. And so we got proportional representation. And so you have a lot of instant political parties that turn up, or political parties that are just over the 5% threshold. And I think it's those parties whose members may not have the slightest idea of what the cabinet manual is and what New Zealand's political traditions are, who perhaps are more exposed to the sorts of forces that need to be kept under control. So someone says to a party on about 4% in the polls, look, we're very interested in developing certain extractive industries, so we'll give you a certain amount of money toward your campaign. It becomes almost a one-stop shop, and there aren't those inherent checks and balances that there are in the National and Labour parties. So the political culture's changed. We can't take this stuff for granted. We can't assume that the norms that applied in the 1960s to the two-party state apply in the 2024s to a multi-party democracy. That which was taken for granted can no longer be taken for granted. As I said, there needs to be zero tolerance on this stuff, otherwise it gets away on you. And that is why we need some clear rules, and why I will say later in the seminar that there is a perfect opportunity upon us now to address some of them.
Yes, thank you, Chris. Those are very valuable points. And I've also noticed the revolving door syndrome, minister to advocate for whatever.
Or the other way around.
Yeah, within a very short time. And I think it's a slippery slope, and I think the report is right to start calling this out now before, as Philippa says, we see a major crisis. And there are things we can do, and we can explore those a bit further. But I think we're left a bit queasy by some of the things that we see. Coming back to Professor Yuen, what do you see as the real risks and costs of not addressing these issues of access money?
Sure. Great question. At the outset, I should emphasize that the ambiguity here is that access money is not a direct threat to economic growth, unlike the usual forms of corruption like bribery, extortion, and embezzlement. But access money is a threat to democracy. When existing metrics repeatedly show that high-income democracies are free from corruption, that prevents leaders and elites from seeing that the public can become frustrated with the system being rigged in favor of the rich and powerful. And it is precisely this kind of perception that is driving a loss in the trust of government and in democratic decline in many advanced democracies. In fact, when I was first introducing the Unbundled Corruption Index and the concept of access money, I faced quite a lot of resistance from some academics and elites from high-income democracies, because they are very uncomfortable with confronting the reality that even in high-income democracies, you can have problems with cronyism, with exchanges of power for favors. So from that dimension, I really do want to commend the Helen Clark Foundation for your willingness to honestly and bravely confront access money as a potential threat to democracy and taking proactive measures to address the threat. I know that in your report, you pointed out that there's a strong belief that access money is a problem in New Zealand, with 65% of New Zealanders agreeing that, quote, our economy is rigged to advantage the rich and powerful. However, one of the great challenges in tackling the problem of excess money, which is why I introduced this term, is that in many ways, it doesn't fit with conventional definitions of corruption, which we think about instinctively as an illegal activity, right? In many instances, like lobbying, it is not wrong. It is an essential part of democratic representation that cannot be taken away. And what you often find in the real world is a wide spectrum of activities in lobbying, for instance, from everything that is entirely legitimate to something that becomes problematic because the system has been abused by a group that has too much power. That is why access money, I think, needs to be introduced as a term, because that helps us to differentiate it from activities where it's explicitly legal and you can curb these activities with laws, regulations, and punishments. The very concept of access money, its ambiguity, the wide network of actors involved, the fact that you can have a system that has an access money problem while the individuals are in fact not corrupt, all of this makes the problem really much more complex and difficult than conventional corruption. And again, that is why I think the Helen Clark Foundation really deserves a lot of credit for initiating this dialogue, because the solutions will not just be about legal measures. They necessarily also will have to be a social dialogue, right? About what the public wants, what they expect their governments to deliver. What are the lines that we should draw between democratic representation and excessive lobbying? So I'm really, really, again, just delighted to be part of this dialogue that you've started.
Thank you, Yuen. And I think the point you make about raising the issues for the public to consider is extremely important. Access money in plain terms is buying access. And in New Zealand, with its traditional sense of fair play, we don't like to think that some have more access than others because they can buy it. So it immediately plays into a traditional value system, which one would hope is still very much current. So I think that's a very important point. I'm going to come back to the Honourable Chris Finlayson. Obviously, Chris, the report traverses a number of issues and has quite a lot of recommendations. If you were to single out the highest priorities for action, what would you single out?
Well, I do think our electoral finance laws do need to be refreshed. That's point number one. There are some aspects of the report that I think one could push for change right now. When I was Attorney General, after the senior courts legislation was passed, I had the idea of bringing together all the legislation dealing with Parliament in a Parliament bill. And it had what could only be described as a cetacean-like gestation period. Chris Hipkins, when he was leader of the House with Trevor Mallard and Adrian Ruafei, did most of the heavy lifting with David Wilson, who is the clerk of the House. And the Parliament bill was introduced to Parliament a couple of weeks ago, and it's gone to a select committee. And I think there's an opportunity, and I'd be very happy to talk to Philippa about it, that some of what she's talking about could in fact be the subject of submission to the special committee, the Committee on Parliament, which is under the chair of Adrian Ruafei, and we'll be hearing submissions shortly. So I think there's an opportunity to deal with issues. Well, my particular issue, for example, that I think the Parliament bill lacks is the equivalent of a congressional budget office, the equivalent of which appears in both the Parliament of Canada Act and in the Australian Constitutional Act. And I think that would provide for transparency about or independent advice on the costings of political parties. I think that we could possibly examine the applicability of the Official Information Act. I think that the rules on lobbying and conflict of interest could be toughened up, and possibly there could be reference to it there. So I think there's an opportunity to do some of that stuff right now. And I don't necessarily think it would be out of scope. On the issue of the electoral finance legislation, I think that there does need to be a standalone piece of work, but I'd like to think that the two big parties, what is apparent is you've got to get the buy-in from the two big parties so that it endures, and there's an opportunity there. But I'm really interested in the Parliament bill and what we could try and get into that as part of the discussion to the Committee on Parliament.
Yes, excellent points. And I should add that the director of the foundation, Murray, I think accompanied by Philippa, visited the Minister of Justice and got a very respectful hearing about the report in the last 2 or 3 weeks, and also visited the opposition spokesperson. So at least this has been put on the plate, but I agree there's some specific zeroing in now on the opportunity the Parliament bill represents. Philippa, coming back to you before we come to the audience, the report got a good amount of media attention when it was launched, with the focus of that mainly around lobbying, political donations, and the Official Information Act. But you did include beneficial ownership in the report, as you underlined today. Any sort of last word from you on why you raised that at this time?
Before I talk about that, I do also want to say that we also had good meetings with the ACT and the Green Party spokespeople on these issues, and they were also quite interested. So it's not a sort of big party, small party thing. We had some really good meetings across the political spectrum, and I think a lot of parliamentarians are quite engaged with these issues. So back to beneficial ownership. Beneficial ownership has a number of benefits. It's almost kind of an regulating it well has a number of benefits across a range of issues. It's quite important for combating money laundering. Money laundering is quite a large problem, and because New Zealand has a relatively good reputation as a non-corrupt country, we actually attract money from offshore, from the proceeds of corruption, where people want to bring their corrupt money into New Zealand, because when they take it out again, it sort of looks clean because it's been through, this clean country. So we kind of are part of global money laundering networks. We saw that with the Panama
Philippa,
Papers.
you're breaking up a bit. I'm not sure if it's just me or whether it's others as well.
I'm
seem
sorry.
to be losing you a wee bit there.
I'm
just
sorry.
me. Okay, carry on.
Might be my network is not great. Anyway, New Zealand is a destination for the proceeds of corruption and crime from other countries. And so we need to be making sure that if we have a beneficial ownership register, it makes it harder to bring money into the country from corrupt sources, and that money can be more easily traced by sort of offshore anti-corruption watchdogs. And it's also quite helpful in being able to trace who is lobbying, who's funding lobbyists, and who's funding political campaigns. So we have recommended that only actual natural people should be allowed to make political donations. But at the moment, for example, we have restrictions on offshore people being able to donate to elections or political parties. But those restrictions are very easily circumvented by setting up New Zealand companies to donate through, and having transparency around beneficial ownership means that we have a better idea of who's actually donating to political parties, because sometimes you'll see an electoral return and it just says, ABC Company Limited, and nobody has any idea who they are because they're owned by XYZ, who's owned by 123, and just goes on and endless chains. So it is quite an important issue. It was on the previous government's agenda. I believe officials got as far as drafting a bill, but the current minister dropped that in his review of the Companies Act. So that's a bit of a lost opportunity there.
Yeah, thank you, Philippa. I'm aware from my association with the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative that beneficial ownership disclosure has been very useful to countries when they're considering permit applications. And if, for example, they see that the beneficial ownership is obscure or has known risky people, that's a steer not to go down that particular track. So I'm going to come into the audience questions now, and we've got a big audience and there are a lot of questions. So if we don't get to yours, please understand. I'm going to start with Seamus Drown, who says, I haven't fully read the report yet, but it's stated that our corruption ratings are falling recently. Over what time frame has this been happening? And what could you say specifically about current and recent governments in relation to this? So, Philippa, you did the research. What's the time frame that you see the rankings slipping over?
So this has been happening over about, I think it's over about the last 10 years. We used to kind of swap around 1 and 2 for a while, and then it was 2 and 3, and now we sort of seem more firmly in position number 3. And I would also recommend Transparency International recently published a report on this decline, and they've done some more work verifying and trying to look at the reasons why that decline has happened. They conclude that it's sort of actually across the board. There's not really 1 or 2 specific things you can point to, but it's sort of a general loss of trust and increased perception of corruption. So they do think it's real. So I would recommend having a look at their report if you want to really dig down into the detail of what's going on there.
And is that New Zealand Transparency International or global?
That's New Zealand Transparency International.
Okay.
Throw a link
if anyone could
chat.
put a link in the chat,
Yeah.
I think people would be interested in that. Thank you. Marie Dool has a question. Vested interests tend to be masterful at framing their objectives as being aligned with the public interest. And of course, there is some alignment generally, but the nebulous concept of the public interest itself does confound diagnosis of capture/corruption. Any thoughts on how to sharpen this definition for those purposes and enable more defensible diagnosis? Chris, would you like to field that one?
Not really, but I'll try. That's a very good question. It's a very tough one because, yes, people invoke the public interest all the time when really it's not the public interest, but it's a sector of the public interest or it's personal interest. And so there's no one fix-all answer to that very searching question. But I guess what we've been talking about is what are a range of mechanisms that could be passed by Parliament to improve transparency and accountability that will enable us to talk about public interest in an apolitical national sense. But it's a really good point because invocation of the public interest, take, for example, an industry that's been referred to on a number of occasions this morning, the extractive industries. Oh, it's in the national interest that we have access to these minerals to improve the wealth of communities, for example, on the West Coast, and to lower unemployment and so on. You can invoke the national interest whenever it suits you for a particular purpose. What Philippa is talking about is a set of policies that will enable New Zealand to talk about the national interest in, as I say, apolitical and more general terms.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. Yuen, we have a question from Dan O'Brien, which says, what's the role of the media in shedding light on these issues? Or are they themselves a victim of political influence? Can an independent media be supported further? Any thoughts on the role of the media here?
Oh, that's a great question. I must say that I've been very impressed by the sharpness and quality of questions that's been coming in through the Q&A. You know, historically, for example, during the what is known as the U.S. Gilded Age, which was a time when America was having rapid economic takeoff, but was extremely corrupt, muckraking journalism, investigative journalism played a very big role in eliminating bribery and extortion in the country. So yes, I think a free, independent, and courageous press is absolutely crucial, but that role has to be reinvented and adapted for a new age where we have access money. And some of the key challenges of journalism in exposing access money is, first of all, that it requires the journalists to have a much higher level of technical knowledge, right, both legal and financial, in order to understand esoteric arrangements like what Philippa had just described, these opaque bank accounts that are being set up for tax evasion and so on. All of that requires journalists with a much higher level of legal, financial, technical knowledge. Another is that we now live in a world where the public has very short attention span, right? So if you reported on a corruption scandal that is about, bribery or stealing 50 million from the treasury, that is an easy story to write and to sell. But to be able to inform the public about the nuances of access money when it's not illegal, when it's institutionalized, when you can't even really prosecute anyone, that is a much harder story to tell. It takes both commitment and professionalism on the part of journalism, but I also think that it will take a high quality and informed citizenry. The two parts have to come together. You need someone to supply that high quality information, as well as a public that demands that sort of high quality journalism.
Yes, and I think also best served by what we'd probably call here long form journalism. So these are, quite complex issues. So the opportunity to have a good documentary with a radio or TV or long form print or online media is important, and the pressures on the news cycle and the nature of programming now often mitigate against that as well. So food for thought. I'm going to come to a question from David Geller and direct it to Philippa. David says, much is made of the hugely important issue of not eroding public trust. Less attention is directed specifically to the advantages of actively engaging civil society in decision-making and moving towards the normalization of using sortition, that was a new phrase to me, I hope Philippa knows it, and citizens' assemblies to guide governments in their decision-making, as opposed to just leaving it to government. What's your view on opportunities like this for New Zealand, Philippa?
Okay, so for those who don't know, sortition is an idea of governing by ballot. So instead of electing 120 parliamentarians, you just randomly select 120 people to go into parliament. Obviously, it doesn't have to be at a legislative level. Things like citizens' juries can do this too. So you randomly select a group of people to have a conversation with experts on an issue, become informed about it, and then draw some conclusions of it on it. There are various kinds of consultation techniques that help to both get an idea of how the general population feels about an issue, but also to make people more informed at the same time and help build some level of consensus. There are other kinds of direct democracy, such as greater use of referendums. Lots of people point to Switzerland on this. And I think there absolutely are many opportunities in New Zealand to use these different and newer techniques. Actually, some of them very old, but to use a greater variety of techniques to get a better understanding of where consensus lies, what issues most people are interested in. And I mean, I think these transparency issues are actually quite a good example, because there is quite a high degree of consensus in the public that they want their parliaments and their governments to be less corrupt. There are perceptions of corruption, And the difficulty is mostly kind of with the 120 MPs in the building, where everyone else has kind of agreed on more or less on what they would like to see. So yeah, I think there are lots of opportunities there, and we should be exploring those.
Yeah. Okay, so let me come to Andrew Ecclestone's question, and I'll direct it to Chris. Andrew asks, since the passage of the Official Information Act, international standards for freedom of information laws have been developed. And one of them is that withholding grounds should always be subject to an overriding public interest test. The withholding grounds in Section 6 of our OIA are not subject to a public interest override. For example, in the UK freedom of information law, the international relations exemption is subject to a public interest override, but New Zealand's withholding ground is not. Do you think, Chris, the Act should be strengthened by adding a public interest test to Section 6?
Yes, I think the Act could be strengthened in a number of ways. When we passed it, I think we were the first in the world to move to this kind of regime and move away from an Official Secrets Act regime, but we've kind of rested on our laurels with the OIA a bit. And I think we've been overtaken by other jurisdictions. And I think Philippa touches on this in her report. So the answer to your question is yes, but not only strengthened in relation to Section 6, but also strengthened in other areas as well. And as Philippa says, and I happen to agree with her, extending the scope of the OIA to the parliamentary precinct. So much has to be done with that legislation, because I think we've slipped behind the rest of the world, and some of those key principles are now somewhat blurred.
Yes, it's old law now, and I think very overdue for a good update. Let me come to Morwenna Mitson-Grills, who asks, and I'll direct this to Professor Yuen, what can, quote, ordinary, unquote, citizens do when they see what appears to be corrupt practice in government? It's so easy to feel powerless and to do nothing.
Wow, that is a great question. It is a very hard question as well. I don't profess to have the answer for that. But I would say that one of the greatest advantages of a democracy is that citizens have the freedom to organize. And so being able, if you see problems with access money, you do have the freedom to get into groups with other concerned citizens to voice, to raise awareness about these issues. So I think that is one possibility. And another thing that I have, at least myself, taken away from this discussion is this is a really informed and concerned citizenry that I'm hearing in the Q&A. I'm really impressed by that. I am hopeful in thinking that given New Zealand's high quality of governance, your informed and concerned citizenry, and your willingness to address these issues of access money, that I think that could be a real opportunity here for New Zealand to, show, to demonstrate a way forward of how we can tackle these issues, not only in terms of laws and legislations, but also in terms of civic participation. I don't know enough about the New Zealand context to comment on the avenues for participation, and I think I would leave Helen or Philippa to comment on that. But I would just emphasize that there is a real opportunity here. In many other countries where I've spoken on the same issue, even in the United States, which is a high income advanced democracy, there's a real sense of powerlessness among citizens because there's a great distance between the federal government and a citizen on the ground. I think New Zealand is in a much better condition, not only because it's a much smaller country, but I think you strike me at least as having much stronger solidarity, a much stronger sense that an average citizen can voice an opinion and make a difference.
Thank you, Yuen. Very important points. I've got a question from David Shand, which I'll put to Chris. David, remembered by many of us, as the winner on the night of the Wellington Central electorate in 1975. But the result didn't stick. But David says, yes, lobbyists may seek preferential access to political decision makers. But what about, quote, corruption, end quote, in terms of concentrated media, press and social power, e.g. Murdoch Press, bypassing this by influencing public opinion in favour of a particular action or decision by concentrated media power? What controls are possible here? Chris, any reflections on this? I don't think we have Murdoch Press in New Zealand these days, but is this concentration of media power potentially also an issue?
Yeah, well, I acknowledge you, David. To have lost by 27 votes must have been a nightmare. I never affected me because I always lost to Annette by about 10,000. If I can simply say this, yeah, I actually was reflecting on your question because I was looking at the Q&As, and you're absolutely right. The Murdoch Press is a very good example. Although Fox News seems to have become less hyper-partisan, I don't know. Because I think maybe they can see through Trump now. But it's a real problem, and I don't know that there's a very easy answer to it. Wasn't, Helen, in the 1960s, wasn't there an attempt to keep Murdoch out of New Zealand, for example, the news media ownership legislation? I don't know that that worked. The trouble is that most media these days are in one camp or another. And they are propaganda sheets. The nearest thing we have to a newspaper of record in New Zealand is the Herald, and it's not a shadow of what it used to be. So I literally, David, don't know the answer to your question, whether it's something that's too large for one country to control. Helen, I'd be interested in your views, but having reflected on David's insightful question, I have to say, after all the verbiage, David, I have no immediate answer. I don't know.
I mean, we do have laws governing concentration of media ownership, as I understand it still. But our media is under incredible pressure, isn't it? Yeah. The economics are just against the more conventional media, but we are seeing quality online media. And maybe part of its challenge is to become more broadly known to the general public. I think, the journalists at Newsroom NZ or the Spin-Off, for example, do a terrific job. There's others like Bernard Hickey who does, regular podcasts and newsletters, but often this isn't as accessible to the general public as, turning the dial on the radio or whatever. So how quality journalism can reach all demographics is an issue. Does it need to be on TikTok? Does it need to be on Spotify? What is it that it will take to get through to, for example, younger generations? Philippa, Nick Pacey says, we need an independent commission against corruption. You didn't go quite that far. What do you think?
I think we probably do need to have a look at our anti-corruption institutions. The anti-corruption roles are kind of spread out across quite a broad range of agencies, and some things do fall through the cracks between them. Part of the issue is that there are a whole lot of things that look like corruption that aren't illegal yet, and I think part of the making them illegal would actually be having some institutions to enforce that. I think the police really struggle with this. For example, police have to enforce electoral law, and I think they really, really struggle with that. We saw recently what seemed like an absolute open and shut case of failure to declare donations, and through carelessness, not through kind of deliberate malice. But there is a separate law against that, and it was very surprising to see the police decide not to prosecute that. And I am concerned that some of the institutions are not necessarily independent enough. And I think as we improve our laws, we probably would need a separate anti-corruption agency to deal with these things.
Well, I agree with Professor Yuen that the questions have been outstanding. And if we had another 2 hours, we'd probably get through many more of them, which we don't have, as we're very close now to closing time. If I could end with one constructive suggestion. New Zealand is still a member of the Open Government Partnership, which, in full disclosure, I happen to be a global ambassador for on a totally pro bono and voluntary basis, and just chaired a major event for them at the UN, a major round table. And the Open Government Partnership, countries that come in on the basis that government and civil society will work together to improve openness and transparency in government. Now, under those proceedings, there is a joint action plan, which is co-developed. In New Zealand, the partner for coordinating government has been State Services Commission, and then there's been a range of civil society partners, including Transparency International local branch. Suzanne Snidely has, of course, been active in that in the past, if not still. So it may be that leading up to the next joint action plan, some of these issues could also be put on the agenda of our Open Government Partnership. The meeting I chaired in the UN last Thursday, or on the margins of the UN General Assembly, had representatives from many countries and their civil society, and really very encouraging to hear the innovative things that are being done. So again, I think Professor Yuen called on us to be innovative, and I think we have opportunities to do that. So thank you so much to our three panelists, Honourable Chris Finlayson, Philippa Yasbek, Professor Yuen Yuen Ang, and back to you, Murray.
Thank you, Helen. That's the conclusion of today's webinar. Thank you very much to the Honourable Chris Finlayson, to Philippa Yasbek, and Professor Yuen Yuen Ang for your really thoughtful insights today, and to Helen for facilitating an excellent discussion between our panelists. And thanks to you, our viewers, for tuning in, and as ever, thanks to our members for supporting our work. A reminder, if you're not already a member of our foundation, you can sign up today at helenclark.foundation. We'd be delighted to have you. We look forward to seeing many of you, our members, at our next webinar, Tuesday lunchtime, with journalist Peter Bale, speaking of excellent local high-quality New Zealand journalists, where Peter and Helen will be discussing key global trends after Helen's recent time at the UN. So until then, noho ora mai, mate wā, and thank you for joining us today.